The city of New York in the early 20th century was a city of dazzling contrasts. Skyscrapers pierced the sky, streetlights illuminated bustling avenues, and the promise of the American dream shimmered in the windows of shop fronts and theaters. Yet beneath the glittering surface lay a hidden world, a world of shadowed alleys, whispered deals, and streets ruled not by law, but by fear and power. This was the America of immigrants, hustlers, and dreamers, where opportunity existed alongside violence, and ambition could tip into ruthlessness with a single misstep. In this twilight between aspiration and corruption, one man would rise to a level of influence that few imagined possible, a man whose name would become synonymous with organized crime, Lucky Luciano. Born Salvatore Lucania in Sicily, Luciano arrived in New York as a young boy, carrying with him the weight of poverty, displacement, and an instinct for survival honed on the rough streets of Palermo. But New York was a different kind of battleground. Here, ethnic enclaves clashed, gangs fought brutal wars over territory, and corruption threaded through politics, police, and business alike. Luciano was not just a participant in this world. He became its architect. He studied it, understood it, and manipulated it with an intelligence and audacity that would transform organized crime from chaotic street-level brawls into a finely tuned enterprise. The story of Lucky Luciano is not merely one of violence or criminal enterprise. It is a story about the psychology of power, the allure of control, and the human hunger to rise above circumstance. It is about a man who learned early that respect could be earned with a gun, maintained with fear, but truly cemented with vision. As the camera pans over the bustling waterfronts, crowded tenements, and the shadowed interiors of speakeasies, the audience begins to feel the tension between light and dark, law and lawlessness, the surface of civilization and the murky world beneath it. This opening sequence is designed to draw the viewer in, to make them feel both awe and unease. It invites them to step behind the curtain and enter a world few would dare to enter voluntarily. The narrative will explore how ambition, strategy, and sheer audacity allowed one man to rise above chaos, creating not only a criminal empire, but a legacy that would echo through decades of organized crime. From the first whispers of his name in New York's Lower East Side to the boardrooms and backrooms where power was brokered in silence, the story of Lucky Luciano is the story of America's underworld being transformed into something terrifyingly modern, efficient, and unrelenting. In these first moments, the tone is set. The city itself is a character, alive and unpredictable, just like the man we are about to follow. Every street corner, every hidden doorway, every shadowed alley is part of the stage upon which Luciano would build his empire. The story that follows will take us deep into the human mind, into the moral compromises, psychological games, and strategic brilliance that defined his life. Here, at the intersection of light and darkness, power and vulnerability, we meet Lucky Luciano, a man who would change the rules of crime forever. Before Lucky Luciano could rise, the criminal landscape of America was a chaotic, almost anarchic world, fractured along ethnic lines and defined by raw violence. The streets of New York, Chicago, and other major cities were a patchwork of small gangs, each controlling its own corner, tavern, or illicit trade. Italian, Irish, Jewish, and other immigrant groups jostled for influence, their alliances as fragile as they were temporary. Law enforcement existed, but corruption ran deep. Police officers often turned a blind eye in exchange for bribes, and politicians played a dangerous game of patronage with those who ruled the streets. It was a world where loyalty could shift with the promise of a few extra dollars or a chance at survival, and betrayal often carried a bullet in its wake. In the 1920s, Prohibition ignited the flames of this volatile environment. With alcohol illegal, opportunity multiplied for those willing to skirt the law. Speakeasies flourished, underground distilleries thrived, and the demand for contraband created fortunes overnight. But these fortunes were rarely built peacefully. Gangs engaged in violent turf wars, often erupting in brutal, public shootings that terrified the public and fascinated the media. In these early years, organized crime was little more than fractured anarchy, a series of competing fiefdoms with no overarching strategy, no real vision beyond the accumulation of wealth and the protection of one's immediate crew. Figures like Giuseppe Joe the Boss, Masuria, and Salvatore Maranzano exemplified this era. They commanded respect through fear, their empires cemented by brutality rather than diplomacy. Masuria, a traditionalist, demanded obedience and loyalty, punishing any deviation with swift violence. Maranzano, meanwhile, sought to model the Mafia along old Sicilian lines, imposing a rigid hierarchy that often clashed with the fluid, opportunistic nature of New York's criminal world. These men represented power, yes, but they also represented stagnation. Their methods were rooted in tradition, their strategies reactive rather than proactive, and their inability to adapt would become the very opening Luciano needed. Amid this chaos, the public's perception of crime was paradoxical. Newspapers sensationalized the violence, turning mobsters into both villains and antiheroes. The Roaring Twenties glamorized rebellion, and the media played its part in mythologizing these figures, making the underworld a spectacle as much as a threat. But behind the headlines, everyday life in these neighborhoods was harsh. Immigrant communities were crowded and impoverished, police protection was inconsistent, and crime was an unavoidable part of daily survival. For young men like Luciano, this world was not just a playground. It was a school, a proving ground, and ultimately a battlefield. In this fractured underworld, every misstep could be fatal, every alliance temporary. Unlike the chaotic gangs that came before him, Luciano saw an opportunity to bring order to the disorder. He recognized the limits of fear-based leadership and understood that power could be multiplied through structure, negotiation, and vision rather than sheer brutality. While other mobsters were stuck in cycles of vendetta and violence, he was studying patterns, learning human behavior, and imagining an empire that could transcend these street-level conflicts. This section frames the contrast between the old world and the new, between the reactive, brutal leaders of the past and the strategic, calculating mind that would soon rise. It shows the audience that the chaos was not an obstacle, but a foundation for Luciano's genius. By immersing viewers in this violent, unregulated landscape, the narrative underscores the genius of someone who could see beyond the immediate, who could transform fear into loyalty and chaos into an empire. The stage is set. The world before Luciano is a world of brutality, inefficiency, and missed opportunities, a world crying out for a new order. In this crucible of violence and ambition, the seeds of the American Mafia were sown, and the streets themselves would soon bear witness to a man who could change the rules of power forever. Lucky Luciano's story begins not in the boardrooms of New York, but in the crowded, sun-scorched streets of Lercara Fritti, Sicily, where he was born Salvatore Lucania in 1897. His early years were shaped by a world of scarcity and hardship, where survival demanded cunning, toughness, and adaptability. Sicily at the turn of the century was a place where social hierarchy was rigid and opportunities were scarce. Families relied on close-knit communities and unspoken codes to navigate daily life. Luciano's father struggled to provide for his family, and the young boy quickly learned that the world did not reward innocence. It rewarded those who could assert themselves. The move to New York's Lower East Side in 1906 was both a blessing and a curse. On one hand, America offered hope. Streets filled with immigrants chasing dreams of prosperity, children playing in crowded tenements, and endless potential beyond the horizon. On the other, the city was unforgiving. Tenements were cramped, hygiene was poor, and the neighborhood teemed with poverty, crime, and desperation. For young Luciano, the streets were classroom. He observed older boys and men testing boundaries, skirmishes over territory, and the subtle negotiations that kept the underworld functioning. He quickly understood that respect was earned, not given, and that power often came wrapped in intimidation. Luciano was small but quick, intelligent, and fiercely ambitious. Unlike some of his peers, he did not rely solely on brute force. He learned to read people, to anticipate threats, and to leverage fear and loyalty as tools of influence. Early on, he became involved in petty crimes, pickpocketing, small thefts, and street hustles, not merely out of necessity, but as a way to test his own limits. These formative experiences taught him the fundamentals of risk and reward, the dynamics of territory, and the importance of reputation in a world where a single insult or failure could be fatal. Education in traditional schools offered little refuge. While Luciano could read and write, the lure of the streets, where tangible power and immediate results awaited, proved irresistible. He began associating with small gangs, learning the informal hierarchies that governed them. It was here, among older and more experienced criminals, that he first grasped the importance of alliances, strategic thinking, and timing. The young street kid from Sicily was developing a mindset that would later redefine organized crime. He was learning that brains could surpass brawn, and that vision and strategy could achieve what violence alone never could. Family, too, played a dual role in shaping his early psyche. While providing care and a sense of belonging, the family structure also reinforced lessons in authority, obedience, and negotiation. Luciano observed adult interactions, the subtle cues of power, respect, and hierarchy, and internalized them. He watched how disputes could escalate into violence, how grudges festered, and how loyalty was both currency and weapon. These lessons, learned in the confined tenements and bustling streets of the Lower East Side, were the foundation of his future empire. By his teenage years, Luciano was no longer merely a participant in street life. He was beginning to manipulate it. Small robberies became opportunities to test alliances. Skirmishes between gangs became arenas to observe power dynamics. He cultivated friends and allies selectively, understanding that loyalty could be a strategic advantage, but trust was a liability until proven. The boy who had arrived in America with nothing was quietly crafting a blueprint for influence, a blueprint built on observation, calculation, and ambition. Psychologically, these early experiences instilled in Luciano a unique combination of resilience and pragmatism. He developed a capacity to suppress emotion when necessary, to weigh outcomes coldly, and to anticipate both the desires and fears of others. While many of his contemporaries relied on intimidation and impulse, Luciano began to rely on planning, foresight, and calculated risk. This intellectual edge, paired with a willingness to commit violence when required, would later make him nearly unstoppable. The Lower East Side, with its cacophony of voices, smells, and conflicts, was both his playground and his proving ground. Here, in the crowded streets where gangs clashed and the line between survival and death was thin, Luciano's ambition was forged. Every encounter, every fight, every alliance contributed to his understanding of power. By the time he reached his early 20s, he was no longer simply a street kid. He was a rising figure, quietly building the foundation for what would become a criminal empire that spanned nation. Through this lens, the audience sees more than just a biography. They witness the psychological evolution of a boy into a man whose mind worked like a chessboard. The poverty, the struggle, and the chaos were not just obstacles. They were the very forge that shaped his strategic brilliance. The streets had trained him, the harshness had refined him, and the constant threat of death or betrayal had sharpened his instincts. It was this blend of environment, psychology, and ambition that would propel Lucky Luciano from the alleys of New York into the annals of criminal legend. A man who could see patterns where others saw chaos, and opportunities where others saw danger. By the time Lucky Luciano reached his late teens, the Lower East Side had become more than just a home. He encountered the seasoned players of the city's. The streets were unforgiving. It was here that he learned the intricate rules of power, where only the clever and survival, ruthless lessons far beyond anything taught. Luciano was fortunate. Early associations with his early experiences gave him a taste of hierarchy and street fights had honed. But it was his exposure to more experienced criminals. He was ready to step beyond petty skirmishes into the organized world of gang influence. Names like the boy from Le Corriere was becoming a man who could navigate not just the street brawls of New York. They would shape his very philosophy politics of the criminal underworld. Each figure represented Luciano's initiation into the 5 Points Gang marked the cautious tactician. Unlike many street kids who joined gangs for protection or thrill, Luciano saw this as an opportunity for strategy. Luciano absorbed the 5 Points were notorious could be orchestrated with the precision of business, but they also served as a training ground subtle leadership, diplomacy, loyalty, Rothstein, in particular. Luciano learned the unspoken rules known as the brain. Rothstein was the architect behind New York's underground economy. Every small job, gambling, running errands, bootlegging, collecting and racketeering, enforcing local claims, highly organized, was a lesson in human behavior. He understood the value of and the careful orchestration, the importance of connections, and the power. It was during this period that Luciano began cultivating his reputation. Under Rothstein's biggest tutelage or the strongest, Luciano saw but he was precise, silence alone was inefficient and fearless. Power required rumors subtlety, spread quickly about his audacity and an understanding of human psychology. Unlike his Rothstein peers, often relied solely on violence, his influence extended into every corner Luciano of the city, combined demonstrating that control could be exercised. He understood that fear could be amplified when paired with unpredictability. The Italian-American mobster, a single decisive act performed at the right moment, offered another secure respect for years. The art of timing, this skill would become one of his most potent had survived alliances in the underworld during this time because he was the strongest Luciano, but because he knew when to act, individuals to negotiate, whose talents complemented his own. Luciano, most notable among them, was Meyer Lansky, noting how boy genius of numbers and strategy, fear, who brought an analytical aware of the political, otherwise chaotic criminal and economic currents. Lansky's vision of organized it was not merely rational strength that ensured profit-driven enterprise. It was foresight, perfect patience, with Luciano's and a keen eye for potential allies. They began thinking not just about local dominance, meanwhile, but about the larger Luciano to the analytical side. Alliances, his approach was systematization of crime, almost mathematical. Another key figure was Bugsy Profit, whose audacity and recklessness could be harnessed in service of larger plans. Lansky these relationships began to early signs of criminal Luciano's ability to transcend traditional rivalries, manipulate ego, one governed not and coordinate action toward common feuds. Luciano also began collaboration his understanding of law enforcement. This vision contrasted sharply with the legal system dominating neither uniform nor invincible. Where old world traditions observed which officers were corrupt and hindered long-term which precincts could be Luciano's mind and where discretion could be turned into leverage, synthesizing while many young gangsters viewed a new kind of setbacks. One Luciano treated them as opportunity for while maintaining the intimidation. He began understanding the delicate balance of fear. These formative encounters and also taught him a vital balance that would allow him to operate above street-level thugs were intertwined and below the radar, but they were not law enforcement for years. Many gangsters relied the economic context on intimidation to amplify these opportunities. Yet Luciano Prohibition had created a black market economy worth millions. To command with alcohol smuggling, he needed a system where underground distribution and punishments forming a lucrative way, and where allies street-level gangs fought over neighborhoods and petty crimes. This was a revolutionary understanding for the criminal world of the 1920s. He saw that strategic framework that allowed him to envision a mafia combined with disciplined management strategies and long-term could yield wealth rather than power on an unprecedented scale. The city itself became unlike traditionalists who clung to old Luciano codes law enforcement, petty rivalries. Politicians, Luciano was focused on efficiency, learning how legal loopholes, corruption, during political patronage could be exploited. Luciano's personality began to crystallize. He realized that the criminal world was not separate from legitimate society. And strategic it existed in parallel. He learned to read commerce, to persuade without coercion, and to inspire loyalty, measuring reactions. His leadership was subtle, but Luciano began to operate. He didn't just command steps. He orchestrated. He understood that the perception of control could be each confrontation was an experiment in understanding the mechanics this psychological sophistication set him by the time Luciano reached his early 20s, making him he was no longer just a participant in gang adversary. He was violence remained a tool, human behavior, but it was wielded selectively and organizational. Whereas other gangsters acted he understood that the mafia's survival Luciano calculated not only on strike force, but also on leadership, each negotiation. He recognized that indiscriminate brutality. It was in this period that he began to stabilize potential networks and draw considering not just immediate gains, but the long-term architecture. He was learning to treat crime as an enterprise, learned from long-term strategic rivals. and the streets themselves and the careful allocation would become the foundation of his revolutionary approach. This approach distinguished him from his peers and psychologically foreshadowed his future as the architect Luciano learned modern American to manage risk by his early emotions. And Luciano had begun to attract attention. He developed an almost surgical understanding of influence. He was recognized how to gain trust as someone capable of seeing beyond the and how to orchestrate outcomes. A thinker in a world dominated by reactionary unnecessary danger. His charisma was a convergence of negotiate with rival experience and audacity and corrupt that set him apart from his contemporaries. While his ruthless efficiency, while many in the underworld relied solely on the transformation from street punk, Luciano relied on was now complete. Combined with strategy, he was no longer just a survivor to create a new paradigm of power. He was a strategist, this section highlights, and a man with a vision for power that extended far beyond any but the psychological transformation he underwent. This ascent from a street smart risk. He evolved into a underworld was inherently capable of orchestrating complex operations, betrayal, alliances, and sudden violence. It sets the stage for allies to turn into enemies overnight, showing that his empire was not built on impulse. Luciano's ability to navigate, but on careful observation, relied calculated risks, only on his intelligence, and a visionary understanding, but on his psychological insight. The street understanding of human motivation, but the mentors and early alliances. He began to see the patterns that by the time he was ready to move, which alliances were temporary, New York's Mafia, which enemies he was not just prepared. And how influence could be leveraged to create durable structures of power. Strategy, as Luciano moved toward to define his reign. He was already shaping the contours of a criminal empire. His street experience, alliances, strategic thinking, and psychological insight were converging into a formula for success. From the chaotic alleys of Manhattan to the volatile networks of organized crime, he was building both the skill set and the reputation necessary to rise to the highest echelons of the underworld. The boy from Lercarafridi had become more than a survivor. He had become a rising force, a mobster not merely defined by violence, but by vision, intelligence, and the capacity to see opportunities where others saw only chaos. In this phase of his life, the foundation was laid for everything that would follow. Luciano's early adulthood was a period of learning, experimentation, and subtle conquest. He had mastered the streets, built alliances, and begun to understand the architecture of power. He was ready to step onto a larger stage, the world of prohibition, bootlegging, and high-stakes criminal enterprise. From street punk to rising mobster, Luciano was preparing to reshape the American underworld forever. By the late 1920s, Lucky Luciano was no longer merely a rising figure on the streets. He had become a force to be reckoned with. The chaotic criminal landscape of New York was in the midst of transformation, yet remained dominated by old-school bosses who clung to tradition and brute force. The Castellammarese War, a bloody struggle between Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, created a perfect storm of violence and opportunity. Luciano, a man who had spent years observing the inefficiencies and vulnerabilities of these old guards, was poised to seize control, but the path to dominance required both audacity and cold-blooded precision. The war itself was a crucible of violence, betrayal, and strategy. Masuria, representing the old school, demanded loyalty and enforced it with unflinching brutality. His reign was grounded in fear, tradition, and a rigid hierarchical structure that left little room for innovation. Maranzano, his rival, attempted to impose a Sicilian-style dictatorship, naming himself the boss of all bosses, expecting unquestioned allegiance. The streets became a battlefield. Assassinations, ambushes, and retaliatory killings punctuated the lives of gangsters and innocents alike. Luciano watched and learned, understanding that to survive and ultimately prevail, one could not merely fight. One had to manipulate the very structure of power itself. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to combine diplomacy, strategy, and decisive violence. He cultivated relationships on both sides, appearing loyal while quietly plotting. His alliance with Meyer Lansky and other trusted lieutenants provided the muscle, planning, and financial backing needed to execute his vision. Luciano understood that the war could not be won by sheer firepower. It required careful timing, the betrayal of the right targets, and an unshakable psychological advantage. Each move was calculated, each alliance temporary, and each act of violence purposeful, not impulsive. This approach distinguished him from the older bosses, who often relied on intimidation and reaction rather than foresight. The turning point came with Luciano's audacious moves against Mafia. Utilizing a combination of deception, alliances, and insider knowledge, he orchestrated the assassination of Mafia in 1931, signaling a seismic shift in the balance of power. This act was not merely about survival. It was a calculated elimination of a rival that cleared the path for a new era. Maranzano briefly assumed control, but his insistence on old-world hierarchies and his autocratic tendencies quickly alienated allies. Luciano, recognizing the unsustainable nature of Maranzano's rule, orchestrated his own assassination shortly thereafter, completing the violent but decisive consolidation of power. What set Luciano apart from his predecessors was not simply his ability to eliminate rivals, but his vision for a new structure of organized crime. Where others saw gangs and turf wars, he envisioned a network governed by rules, alliances, and shared interests. Violence was a tool, yes, but it was also disciplined, reserved for strategic purposes. Luciano's rise demonstrated an unprecedented combination of foresight, psychological insight, and adaptability. He understood the human element, fear, loyalty, ambition, and manipulated it with precision to achieve results that brute force alone could never accomplish. During this period, his personal charisma and strategic acumen were as critical as his ruthlessness. Luciano was known to navigate complex social dynamics with ease, negotiating alliances, settling disputes, and ensuring that his rise was perceived as legitimate within the criminal hierarchy. He did not simply rule by fear. He commanded respect, cultivated loyalty, and projected a vision that promised order in a chaotic underworld. This ability to balance aggression with diplomacy, violence with negotiation, was central to his ascendancy and would become a hallmark of his leadership style. The psychological complexity of Luciano's rise cannot be overstated. He exhibited remarkable patience, self-control, and an understanding of human behavior that allowed him to anticipate rivals' moves, manipulate outcomes, and minimize personal risk. Every assassination, every deal, every alliance was carefully weighed. He approached power like a chess master, always thinking several moves ahead, aware that a single miscalculation could result in death or exile. Unlike many mobsters of his era, his actions were never purely reactive. They were proactive, deliberate, and visionary. By the end of the Castellammarese War, Luciano had effectively reshaped the criminal underworld. The chaotic, fear-driven structures that had dominated New York for decades were replaced by a new order, one rooted in strategic alliances, shared profits, and centralized decision-making. His rise was both violent and cerebral, demonstrating that true power lay not in the number of men or guns one commanded, but in the ability to orchestrate influence, manipulate psychology, and impose vision on chaos. This era also cemented Luciano's reputation as a transformative figure. He had navigated the treacherous waters of betrayal, violence, and political complexity to emerge as the undisputed architect of the modern American Mafia. The psychological and strategic lessons from this period, patience, foresight, and calculated ruthlessness, would inform every decision he made in the years to come. He was no longer simply a street-smart gangster. He was a master of organization, a visionary strategist, and a man whose name would become synonymous with power, innovation, and the calculated application of violence. The rise of Lucky Luciano during the Castellammarese War demonstrates a critical turning point, a shift from chaos to order, from fear-driven obedience to structured loyalty, and from reactive violence to strategic foresight. This section of his story captures not just his ascent, but the birth of a revolutionary criminal philosophy, one that would define organized crime in America for decades. The streets that had once been ruled by intimidation and brutality were now being shaped by a mind capable of turning disorder into empire, fear into loyalty, and ambition into enduring legacy. In the world Luciano was shaping, rules were as vital as muscle, and loyalty as crucial as weapons. At the heart of this system lay omerta, the Mafia's ancient code of silence, honor, and absolute discretion. For outsiders, it was a concept shrouded in mystery, often romanticized in newspapers and films as an emblem of secretive loyalty. But for those who lived within it, omerta was both shield and weapon, a psychological framework that controlled behavior, punished betrayal, and created a fragile yet potent social order. Luciano understood that fear alone could not secure obedience indefinitely. A structured code, rooted in culture and reinforced by consequences, was far more effective. Omerta became the psychological backbone of his empire, a tool to mold men, manipulate rivals, and cement alliances. The code operated on multiple levels. On one hand, it demanded silence, never revealing the secrets, operations, or identities of associates to outsiders, especially law enforcement. On another, it prescribed conduct within the organization, emphasizing loyalty, respect, and reciprocal obligation. For Luciano, omerta was not merely tradition. It was a form of psychological engineering. By codifying loyalty and secrecy, he created a system where betrayal was not only dangerous but unthinkable, where trust and fear coexisted in a delicate equilibrium that benefited him above all. Understanding human psychology was central to Luciano's enforcement of omerta. He knew that men would naturally test boundaries, question authority, and consider self-interest first. To counter this, he layered the code with incentives and punishments. Loyalty was rewarded, protection, wealth, and influence flowed to those who adhered to it. Disloyalty, however, was met with swift, calculated, and public retribution. The consequences were always precise, leaving no ambiguity about the cost of betrayal. In doing so, Luciano ensured that the rules became internalized. Men obeyed not just out of fear, but because the system had conditioned them to understand its necessity for survival and success. Omerta also served as a powerful weapon against law enforcement. In an era of growing public scrutiny, police raids, and federal investigations, secrecy was indispensable. Luciano recognized that the Mafia's survival depended on invisibility and deniability. By instilling absolute silence among his associates, he reduced the risk of exposure and prosecution. The code created layers of protection, insulating him from the consequences of crimes committed by those under his command. Men would die rather than speak, and the organization remained virtually untouchable, a fortress built on obedience and psychological control rather than walls or guns alone. But omerta was more than just a practical rule. It was a form of social and emotional manipulation. Luciano understood that fear alone could foster resentment, rebellion, or paranoia. By embedding loyalty into a cultural and moral framework, he made adherence to the code feel like honor, pride, and identity. Members of the organization internalized the rules, believing they were not only protecting themselves, but also upholding a sacred tradition. In this way, omerta became a form of voluntary submission, where fear and pride intertwined to maintain cohesion and obedience. The code also had a broader strategic purpose. By creating a shared set of expectations, Luciano reduced uncertainty and stabilized relationships across his network. Alliances could be formed more reliably, operations coordinated more efficiently, and conflicts mediated through predictable behavioral norms. Even in a world defined by ambition and ruthlessness, the existence of a shared psychological contract allowed the organization to function like a well-oiled machine. Omerta became a governance mechanism, ensuring order, predictability, and loyalty in an otherwise chaotic and unpredictable underworld. Luciano's application of omerta also reflected a sophisticated understanding of human weakness and desire. He knew that while loyalty could be commanded through fear, true stability required men to internalize the system. By blending tradition, moral obligation, and carefully calibrated consequences, he created an environment where men adhered to the code willingly, even enthusiastically. The psychological effect was profound. Once bound by omerta, individuals became invested in the organization's survival, seeing their own interests as inseparable from its rules. The enforcement of omerta required precision. Luciano could not afford public displays of arbitrary violence, which might undermine loyalty or provoke chaos. Punishments were deliberate, symbolic, and strategically communicated to instill obedience without destabilizing the broader system. By controlling both the perception and execution of discipline, he maintained psychological dominance over his associates, shaping behavior through fear, respect, and the internalization of moral obligation. Omerta also influenced how Luciano managed alliances and rivalries. The code became a framework for negotiation, signaling to both allies and enemies that loyalty was binding, trust was sacred, and betrayal was met with lethal certainty. Even in dealing with external rivals, the principles of omerta shaped his strategy. Manipulation, discretion, and calculated psychological pressure allowed him to neutralize threats without unnecessary violence, preserving resources and maintaining the integrity of his empire. Through this lens, omerta was not simply a rule of conduct. It was Luciano's most powerful tool. It transformed the Mafia from a collection of violent street gangs into a disciplined, cohesive organization capable of operating with both efficiency and secrecy. By institutionalizing fear, loyalty, and psychological control, Luciano ensured that his empire could survive beyond any single individual, and that men would follow him not only because of his power, but because of the deeply internalized belief in the code he had crafted. In essence, omerta under Luciano was both a shield and a sword. It protected the organization from external threats while controlling internal dynamics, creating a psychological infrastructure that magnified his power. It demonstrated his understanding of human behavior, his strategic genius, and his ability to transform cultural tradition into a mechanism of governance. The Mafia, once chaotic and reactive, became disciplined, forward-looking, and virtually untouchable, a testament to Luciano's vision and mastery of both mind and method. By codifying loyalty and secrecy, blending fear with pride, and applying psychological insight to every decision, Luciano elevated organized crime to a level previously unseen. The code of omerta became the invisible architecture of his empire, shaping behavior, directing strategy, and ensuring that power, once seized, could be maintained, expanded, and institutionalized. This section reveals that Luciano's genius was not only in action, but in understanding the mind, his own, his associates, and even his enemies, and leveraging that understanding to transform chaos into order and ambition into lasting power. With power consolidated and the commission established, lucky Luciano turned his attention to the lifeblood of his empire, the business of crime itself. Unlike the chaotic, reactive rackets of his predecessors, Luciano approached criminal enterprise with the mindset of a corporate strategist. Every operation, from gambling dens to labor racketeering, from bootlegging to illicit unions, was meticulously organized and coordinated. Profit was paramount, but efficiency, risk management, and long-term sustainability were equally important. Luciano understood that an empire built on chaos and impulse would collapse as quickly as it rose. To thrive, crime had to be structured, disciplined, and interconnected, a system in which every player had a role, every alliance served a purpose, and every risk was calculated. Bootlegging during Prohibition was the cornerstone of Luciano's early empire. Alcohol, forbidden by law yet demanded by millions, was a commodity of immense value. While many gangs fought violently over distribution, Luciano orchestrated a network that prioritized efficiency over territorial dominance. He negotiated agreements, coordinated shipments, and ensured that profits were maximized while losses and law enforcement exposure were minimized. Violence was deployed selectively as a tool to enforce contracts or intimidate recalcitrant operators, rather than as a reactionary reflex. Through these strategies, Luciano transformed what had been a chaotic black market into a predictable, highly profitable enterprise. Gambling operations provided another pillar of his criminal empire. Luciano recognized that games of chance were both socially tolerated and financially lucrative. By organizing gambling syndicates and maintaining oversight, he turned what were once small, localized operations into sprawling networks with standardized rules, collection systems, and protection mechanisms. Every operation was monitored, and every employee understood the hierarchy, ensuring loyalty and minimizing internal theft or betrayal. This level of organization allowed Luciano not only to increase revenue, but also to demonstrate his command over people, resources, and territories, reinforcing both fear and respect. Labor racketeering represented a more sophisticated extension of Luciano's business acumen. Through control of unions and shipping docks, he was able to extract revenue from industries vital to the city's economy. Strikes, slowdowns, and threats were used strategically, always calibrated to maximize profit and maintain influence without provoking overt law enforcement retaliation. Luciano's ability to integrate legitimate and illegitimate operations reflected a level of vision rarely seen in the underworld. It was not enough to dominate through violence. He needed leverage over industries, infrastructure, and political connections to ensure enduring control. Luciano also ventured into prostitution and narcotics, recognizing that the key to sustaining his empire was diversification. Each enterprise operated semi-autonomously, yet all fed into a central structure, where profits could be monitored, risks assessed, and strategic decisions made at the top. Unlike impulsive criminals, Luciano's approach was methodical. Resources were allocated, hierarchies enforced, and accountability maintained. Violence and intimidation were tools of management, not substitutes for strategy. In this way, Luciano transformed Vice from a series of scattered, dangerous operations into a coordinated, efficient, and highly profitable enterprise. The psychological dimension of his operations was equally critical. Luciano understood that people respond predictably when motivated by profit and constrained by rules. By providing clear incentives, establishing hierarchies, and enforcing discipline, he cultivated loyalty and minimized internal instability. Fear remained a component, but it was balanced with opportunity, creating an environment where men were invested in the system, not just the person. Workers, lieutenants, and associates followed his directives because it served their interests to do so, and betrayal was both personally and financially costly. Luciano's vision extended beyond immediate profit. He saw the potential for national expansion, connecting syndicates in New York, Chicago, and other major cities into a network capable of moving goods, money, and influence seamlessly. The empire he envisioned was both vertically and horizontally integrated. Control over production, distribution, enforcement, and negotiation ensured maximum leverage across industries and territories. This approach reduced inefficiency, eliminated unnecessary conflict, and created a system where power was exercised not only through fear, but through the perception of inevitability. The idea that resistance was futile against such a coordinated force. International connections further expanded his reach. Luciano cultivated relationships with European suppliers, Caribbean ports, and other transatlantic networks, ensuring that his operations were not constrained by local boundaries. Smuggling, import-export schemes, and coordination with allied criminal organizations allowed him to operate on a scale few contemporaries could imagine. His empire was no longer confined to streets or neighborhoods. It was a complex, interconnected web of commerce, strategy, and influence that mirrored legitimate multinational enterprises in its sophistication. This period also highlighted Luciano's innovative use of political and law enforcement connections. Bribes, favors, and mutual benefit agreements ensured that operations could continue with minimal interference. Luciano understood that corruption and influence were as critical to sustain power as guns and loyalty. By manipulating both legitimate and illegitimate structures, he created a system that was resilient, adaptive, and virtually untouchable. Every criminal endeavor, every transaction, and every negotiation was part of a larger, carefully orchestrated framework designed to maximize profit while minimizing vulnerability. The transformation of crime under Luciano was not merely financial. It was psychological and systemic. He imposed discipline, structure, and predictability on a world that had previously been chaotic and impulsive. Every operation reinforced his authority. Every network strengthened his influence. And every calculated act of violence or diplomacy solidified the perception that he was the master of a modern criminal empire. By turning vice into enterprise, chaos into order, and fear into loyalty, Luciano redefined what it meant to wield power in the underworld. Ultimately, the business of crime under Luciano was a reflection of his mind, strategic, disciplined, and visionary. He saw opportunities where others saw risk, patterns where others saw chaos, and profit where others saw disorder. His empire was not a fleeting collection of violent acts, but a carefully constructed system capable of enduring, expanding, and dominating. This section illustrates the genius of Luciano not merely as a criminal, but as an organizer, strategist, and visionary, a man who transformed the underworld into a disciplined, efficient, and highly profitable enterprise. Even the most powerful empires are built on fragile foundations, and for Lucky Luciano, the challenge of maintaining dominance was constant. While he had consolidated power, established the commission, and organized criminal enterprises into a well-oiled machine, the world around him remained volatile. Allies could turn into enemies, rivals could rise in the shadows, and the law was increasingly watching, waiting for any opportunity to strike. In this period, the delicate balance between trust and suspicion became a defining feature of Luciano's leadership. The streets of New York were no longer merely a battlefield. They had become a chessboard, where every move had to be calculated and every alliance scrutinized for hidden agendas. Luciano's circle of allies was complex and expansive, spanning trusted lieutenants, political contacts, and strategic partners in rival families. Figures like Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and Vito Genovese were not just friends or subordinates. They were vital nodes in a network of influence that allowed Luciano to extend his reach across the city, the nation, and even into international markets. These alliances were both protective and productive, enabling coordinated operations, dispute mediation, and the expansion of criminal enterprises. Yet, even the closest allies were not immune to ambition or resentment. Luciano knew that power attracted envy, and that loyalty, however carefully cultivated, could never be taken for granted. Enemies, of course, lurked everywhere. Some were remnants of the old guard, eager to reclaim lost territories or settle vendettas. Others were emerging figures, younger and hungrier, seeking to exploit any weakness or misstep. The tension between consolidation and competition defined this era of Luciano's rule. He was constantly assessing threats, weighing the reliability of his contacts, and preemptively neutralizing potential rivals before they could become dangerous. In this sense, his empire required not only strategic organization, but relentless vigilance, a psychological awareness of human ambition, greed, and resentment that never allowed complacency. Betrayal was always a looming threat. Luciano had learned early in his rise that even trusted allies could be swayed by money, fear, or personal ambition. This knowledge shaped the way he managed relationships, using a combination of incentive, intimidation, and psychological insight to ensure loyalty. Disloyalty was rarely tolerated, but punishment was precise and calculated, designed to reinforce authority without destabilizing the broader organization. By controlling both perception and consequence, Luciano maintained a web of influence that extended far beyond his immediate circle, ensuring that both allies and adversaries understood the stakes of crossing him. The stakes of alliance and enmity were never purely personal. They were strategic, impacting the stability and profitability of the entire empire. Luciano understood that every betrayal, every dispute, and every negotiation had financial, operational, and psychological consequences. By carefully managing relationships, he could ensure that disputes were resolved in ways that reinforced his authority while minimizing unnecessary conflict. This approach transformed what could have been chaotic power struggles into a structured, predictable system, where ambition could be channeled rather than suppressed, and competition could coexist with order. The hidden wars that unfolded during this period were not always fought in public. Assassinations, intimidation, and strategic sabotage were often executed in silence, leaving no trace and minimizing exposure. Luciano's understanding of human psychology allowed him to anticipate reactions, manipulate perceptions, and maintain dominance without always resorting to violence. Yet the threat of violence remained omnipresent, a constant reminder to associates and rivals that loyalty was both expected and enforceable. It was a delicate balance, requiring judgment, timing, and a nuanced understanding of power dynamics that few could match. Psychologically, this period was taxing. Luciano had to navigate an environment in which trust was scarce, ambition was rampant, and exposure to law enforcement was growing. His ability to maintain focus, assess risk, and act decisively under constant pressure demonstrated not only strategic genius, but emotional resilience. Every move was a negotiation with human behavior itself, with ego, fear, loyalty, and greed, and the success of his empire depended on his mastery of these psychological currents. The interplay between allies and enemies during this time also highlights a broader theme. Power is never static. The same network that enabled Luciano to expand his empire also contained the seeds of instability. Rivalries simmered beneath the surface, alliances were constantly tested, and the pressure of expansion introduced new vulnerabilities. Yet Luciano's skill lay in transforming these risks into opportunities, using intelligence, foresight, and psychological manipulation to turn potential threats into reinforcements, or at least neutralizing them before they could act. This period of complex alliances and hidden rivalries was a test of Luciano's leadership at its most sophisticated. He had built an empire that was both powerful and efficient, but maintaining it required constant vigilance, calculation, and the ability to read the minds of those around him. The empire was a living organism, responsive to ambition, fear, and loyalty, and Luciano was its masterful conductor, orchestrating a balance between cooperation and competition, reward and punishment, fear and respect. Through this lens, we see Luciano not only as a strategist and organizer, but as a psychologist of power. He understood the fragility of loyalty, the inevitability of ambition, and the necessity of precise, calculated responses. The web of allies and enemies he managed was not simply a network of people. It was a complex ecosystem of human behavior, where influence, fear, and ambition intersected in ways that could either stabilize or topple an empire. His genius lay in his ability to navigate this ecosystem with foresight, precision, and strategic ruthlessness. By the end of this period, Luciano's position was secure, but never unchallenged. He had demonstrated that power was not merely about strength or wealth, but about the mastery of relationships, perception, and psychological influence. Allies, enemies, and potential rivals all existed within a delicate equilibrium that he carefully maintained. This section illustrates the high-stakes complexity of Luciano's reign, highlighting how the interplay of loyalty, betrayal, and strategic insight allowed him to sustain and expand an empire in a world defined by uncertainty, ambition, and danger. The rise of Lucky Luciano, however, was not immune to the inevitable pressures of law enforcement and public scrutiny. By the mid-1930s, federal authorities had begun to focus intensively on organized crime, spurred by mounting public outrage over the rampant corruption, violence, and vice that had infiltrated New York City. Luciano, despite his careful orchestration of power and meticulous enforcement of secrecy, was not invulnerable. The very visibility of his empire, the audacity of his operations, and the reach of his influence had made him a target. Arrests of associates, wiretaps, and undercover investigations began to close in, signaling that even the most brilliant criminal mind could be ensnared in the relentless machinery of the law. Luciano's arrest in 1936 on charges of compulsory prostitution marked the beginning of a dramatic fall from the public eye, but it was far from a complete collapse of his power. The case was meticulously constructed by law enforcement, who understood that targeting the organizational genius behind the street-level operations was the most effective method of disruption. The trial that followed was a spectacle of both legal maneuvering and media frenzy. Newspapers across the nation highlighted the story, framing Luciano not merely as a criminal, but as a symbol of the organized, modern underworld that had infiltrated the heart of New York. Public fascination mingled with moral outrage, creating a highly charged atmosphere in which every detail of Luciano's empire was dissected, exaggerated, and sensationalized. The courtroom itself became a stage for a high-stakes drama of strategy, perception, and psychological warfare. Luciano, ever the strategist, understood that appearances mattered as much as facts. He maintained a calm, composed exterior, projecting confidence and control even as prosecutors presented damning evidence. Witnesses, some coerced, others motivated by loyalty or fear, offered testimony that painted a complex picture of a man whose power extended far beyond the physical violence of streets. The prosecution sought to portray him as the mastermind of vice, exploitation, and corruption, highlighting the depth and sophistication of his criminal network. Yet Luciano's defense, though constrained, aimed to sow doubt, emphasize his separation from direct acts of violence, and exploit procedural nuances. Public perception played a critical role in the trial's dynamics. The media, hungry for sensationalism, amplified both fear and fascination, turning Luciano into a larger-than-life figure. The archetypal mob boss whose intelligence and audacity were as remarkable as his crimes were abhorrent. The courtroom drama became a reflection of broader societal tensions. The clash between law and lawlessness, morality and ambition, order and chaos. For the audience, the trial was not only about guilt or innocence. It was a moral spectacle, a narrative in which power, cunning, and human psychology collided with the mechanisms of justice. The sentence handed down to Luciano was severe, 30 to 50 years in prison, coupled with fines and the dismantling of key operations. Yet even in confinement, he demonstrated the ability to maintain influence. His empire had been constructed with resilience and redundancy, allowing him to continue directing operations through trusted lieutenants and intermediaries. The trial, while legally decisive, did not completely dismantle the psychological and organizational control he had established. Luciano's ability to navigate the legal system, public perception, and internal networks of power highlighted a rare combination of intellect, adaptability, and strategic foresight. The trial also revealed the limitations and vulnerabilities inherent in organized crime. While Luciano had transformed the Mafia into a disciplined, efficient system, the very visibility and scale of his empire made him a target for legal and political action. The prosecution capitalized on both moral outrage and technical evidence, exposing the underworld's reliance on secrecy, loyalty, and fear. The courtroom became a microcosm of the broader struggle between structured criminal enterprise and societal authority, illustrating the psychological and strategic pressures that even the most organized leader could not entirely control. Psychologically, the trial was a crucible. Luciano was forced to confront the possibility of long-term imprisonment, the fragility of alliances, and the threat of betrayal from within his own network. Yet his composure under pressure, his ability to negotiate behind the scenes, and his foresight in establishing resilient structures ensured that his influence would persist. The trial was as much a test of his psychological acumen as it was of the legal system's ability to restrain him. His capacity to maintain control, even under extreme scrutiny, reflected the depth of his understanding of human behavior, loyalty, and perception. In the aftermath of his sentencing, Luciano's empire faced both challenges and opportunities. While law enforcement aimed to dismantle his network, the organizational structure he had built, codified rules, disciplined hierarchies, and a loyal cadre of lieutenants, allowed operations to continue. The trial highlighted the tension between legality and power, morality and pragmatism, public perception and private influence. Even as he faced a prison sentence, Luciano's strategic mind continued to shape the Mafia's operations, proving that control was not limited to physical freedom, but could extend through psychological influence and organizational architecture. This period marked a turning point in the narrative of power and vulnerability. Luciano's trial demonstrated that even the most brilliant criminal strategist was susceptible to legal forces, media scrutiny, and public outrage. Yet it also underscored the resilience of his systems, the loyalty he had cultivated, and the psychological sophistication that allowed him to maintain influence from behind bars. It was a testament to the duality of his empire, built on both structure and fear, ambition and manipulation, loyalty and deterrence. By the end of the trial, the audience is left with a complex portrait, a man who had achieved unprecedented dominance through intellect, strategy, and psychological mastery, yet was not invincible. The courtroom drama, media spectacle, and sentencing illustrate both the limits of power and the enduring potency of Luciano's genius. This section emphasizes that the fall of a criminal empire is never simple or complete, and that influence, when carefully constructed, can persist even in the face of extraordinary legal and societal pressure. Even behind bars, Lucky Luciano's influence did not vanish. In many ways, it became subtler, yet more profound. Prison was not merely a punishment for him. It was another arena in which power, psychology, and strategy played out. Luciano understood that physical confinement did not necessarily equate to loss of authority. His empire had been meticulously structured to operate autonomously, with lieutenants and intermediaries maintaining operations according to systems he had codified. The Mafia Commission, the network of alliances, and the rules of Omerta ensured that, even in his absence, his directives were executed with precision. Prison became a stage on which the psychological architecture of his empire was revealed, demonstrating the durability of carefully constructed influence. The first challenge was communication. Luciano had to maintain contact with his network without exposing himself or his associates to further legal jeopardy. Letters, intermediaries, and subtle signals became tools of control. Each message was calculated, each conversation measured. Luciano had learned that perception was as powerful as reality. If his subordinates believed he remained omnipresent, his authority would remain intact. This psychological leverage allowed him to maintain a virtual presence, ensuring that operations continued seamlessly despite his physical absence. His prison became an extension of his mind rather than a limitation of it. Within the prison environment, Luciano also demonstrated his uncanny ability to manipulate human behavior. Guards, fellow inmates, and visiting associates became instruments of influence, often without realizing it. By projecting calm authority, offering incentives, and exercising selective intimidation, he cultivated a network of psychological control that extended beyond the prison walls. Even those tasked with oversight became part of the ecosystem, subtly guided by his insight into ambition, fear, and loyalty. It was an extension of the same principles that had allowed him to dominate the streets: observation, calculation, and the strategic management of human behavior. Luciano's ability to maintain power from prison also reflected the structural genius of his empire. Unlike chaotic, personality-driven gangs of the past, his organization had been designed to endure. Hierarchies were clearly defined, responsibilities delegated, and contingency plans established. This redundancy ensured continuity, even in his absence, allowing the business of crime, gambling, unions, bootlegging, and more to continue unimpeded. Luciano had created a self-sustaining system where obedience and initiative coexisted, where fear and incentive balanced, and where the absence of a single individual could be compensated for by the strength of the network. Psychologically, this period reveals Luciano's mastery over both perception and influence. He understood that fear alone could not sustain authority from prison. He needed the appearance of omnipotence. Stories of his reach, whispered warnings, and the meticulous execution of his orders reinforced the mythos of his power. Associates understood that he remained a figure of consequence, capable of rewarding loyalty and punishing betrayal with the same precision as when he had roamed the streets. In this way, Luciano's control became as much a function of reputation and psychological dominance as it was of direct action. The prison period also tested Luciano's strategic patience. Unlike the streets, where rapid decisions could mean survival, prison demanded long-term thinking, resilience, and adaptability. Every move, from negotiating privileges to maintaining alliances, required foresight. Luciano's approach was methodical. He prioritized the preservation of influence, the protection of his network, and the careful management of risk. This patience, combined with his deep understanding of human motivation, allowed him to navigate confinement without ceding authority. Even in a setting designed to restrict freedom, he found ways to exert power. During this time, Luciano also demonstrated a remarkable ability to engage with the larger political and social landscape. He recognized opportunities to leverage his position for negotiation, influence, and long-term advantage. Through intermediaries and strategic relationships, he explored possibilities for early release, favorable treatment, and the preservation of his empire. His incarceration became a calculated interlude, a period in which his direct actions were constrained, but his strategic thinking continued to operate at full capacity. The prison walls, rather than containing him, became an extension of his influence, illustrating that true power is as much psychological and organizational as it is physical. Luciano's continued influence behind bars also highlights a broader lesson about organizational resilience. By designing systems that operate independently of a single individual, he ensured continuity, adaptability, and sustainability. This principle extended to both criminal operations and interpersonal management. Loyalty, incentives, and discipline were embedded in the structure, not merely dependent on charisma or proximity. The genius of Luciano's empire lay in its ability to function effectively regardless of personal circumstances, a testament to his foresight, psychological acuity, and strategic planning. Moreover, this period reinforced Luciano's mythos. The public, law enforcement, and even rivals recognized that imprisonment did not diminish his power. Stories circulated about his continued orchestration of operations, his ability to influence decisions, and his unyielding presence in the underworld. This perception, whether entirely accurate or partially mythologized, served as a force multiplier, enhancing both fear and respect. It demonstrated that authority is not solely derived from proximity or force, but from a cultivated image of competence, control, and inevitability. By the end of this phase, it becomes clear that Luciano's genius was not limited to acts of violence, negotiation, or strategy. It extended to the enduring architecture of influence. Prison did not erode his authority. It tested and revealed it. The systems he built, the psychological insight he applied, and the networks he maintained allowed him to continue exercising control, shaping the underworld, and influencing outcomes far beyond the confines of his cell. This section illustrates that Luciano's mastery of power was multidimensional, a combination of organizational brilliance, psychological insight, and strategic patience that enabled him to wield authority even under the most restrictive circumstances. In essence, Luciano's power behind bars underscores a central truth about leadership, influence, and strategy. True authority is not constrained by physical presence alone. It is cultivated through structures, psychology, and perception, all of which Luciano had perfected. Even in confinement, he remained a master of human behavior, a strategist of operations, and a figure whose influence extended far beyond the reach of law or circumstance. The prison years, rather than marking a decline, became a testament to the enduring potency of his vision, discipline, and understanding of power. The legacy of Lucky Luciano extends far beyond the confines of his own lifetime, shaping not only the American Mafia, but the very blueprint of organized crime around the world. He did not simply rise to power through violence or ambition. He redefined the mechanics of criminal enterprise, introducing structure, strategy, and a level of psychological sophistication that transformed chaotic street gangs into disciplined, enduring empires. Before Luciano, crime was often a reactive, fragmented, and brutal endeavor, driven by local rivalries and impulsive violence. After Luciano, it became a system, organized, hierarchical, and strategically managed, blending fear, loyalty, and profit into a formula that would influence generations of criminals. Luciano's most enduring innovation was arguably the Commission. By creating a governing council for the Mafia, he institutionalized conflict resolution, coordinated operations, and centralized power without resorting to constant violence. This framework allowed families to coexist, disputes to be negotiated, and power to be exercised predictably rather than chaotically. It was a form of corporate governance applied to crime, a system in which human behavior, ambition, loyalty, fear, and pride could be anticipated and managed. The Commission became a model for organized crime worldwide, demonstrating that the combination of structure and psychology could sustain power far beyond the capacity of any single individual. The psychological insights Luciano applied were as influential as his organizational genius. He understood that fear alone was insufficient to maintain loyalty. Respect, pride, and perceived legitimacy were equally crucial. Through the code of omerta, the careful calibration of rewards and punishments, and the orchestration of alliances, he cultivated a network in which obedience was internalized rather than imposed. Members were not just compliant, they were invested, understanding that the stability of the organization was in their own interest. This combination of psychological manipulation and structural engineering allowed Luciano to wield influence with a precision that few contemporaries could match, and his methods became a template for managing human behavior in illicit networks. Luciano's impact on criminal enterprises extended into economic innovation as well. He transformed illegal activities, gambling, bootlegging, narcotics, and labor racketeering, into coordinated, highly profitable operations. Each venture operated within a disciplined system, with clear hierarchies, accountability, and oversight. Profit maximization was not achieved through brute force alone, but through strategy, negotiation, and operational intelligence. By turning crime into enterprise, Luciano blurred the line between legitimate business and organized crime, laying the groundwork for the modern understanding of syndicates as complex, multi-layered organizations capable of both expansion and adaptation. Moreover, his influence transcended borders. Even after his deportation to Italy, the structures he had built in America remained resilient. The Mafia's operations continued to function with precision, demonstrating that his genius had created systems that could endure beyond his immediate presence. International criminal networks began to reflect his principles, incorporating hierarchical organization, conflict mediation, and coordinated operations into their own strategies. In essence, Luciano's vision became a global template for organized crime, a combination of governance, strategy, and psychological insight that reshaped the criminal world. Luciano's legacy is also a study in the duality of myth and reality. Public perception often glamorized him as a master strategist or the ultimate mob boss, while historical analysis reveals a man of extraordinary intellect, strategic acumen, and psychological sophistication. His genius lay not simply in seizing power, but in designing systems that could maintain it. Yet, for all his achievements, Luciano's life was also marked by vulnerability, exile, and confrontation with the law, reminding us that even the most brilliant and disciplined empires are subject to forces beyond individual control. In reflecting on Luciano's life, we see a convergence of ambition, intellect, and human understanding. He transformed fear into loyalty, chaos into order, and ambition into a sustainable empire. The lessons of his life are complex. Power requires not only strength and cunning, but structure, foresight, and the ability to manipulate human behavior with precision. Luciano's influence persists not only in the organizations he shaped, but in the broader understanding of leadership, strategy, and psychology in extreme environments. Ultimately, the legacy of Lucky Luciano is both practical and symbolic. Practically, he built systems, networks, and strategies that would guide organized crime for decades. Symbolically, he represents the potential of intellect, vision, and psychological insight to shape human behavior and institutional power, even in the shadows of society. His life reminds us that mastery of both structure and psychology can transform chaos into enduring influence, and that the mark of genius often lies not in individual acts of violence or ambition, but in the ability to design systems that outlast the individual who created them. The story of Lucky Luciano is a story of contrasts: power and vulnerability, loyalty and betrayal, ambition and consequence. His life, from the gritty streets of early 20th century New York to the halls of the Mafia Commission, and finally to his exile in Italy, reflects the complex interplay between human psychology, organizational genius, and the raw, often brutal mechanics of crime. As the narrative comes full circle, it becomes clear that Luciano's rise and fall are not merely historical events. They're a lens through which we can explore the nature of power, influence, and the human capacity for both creation and destruction. Luciano's legend begins in the unassuming neighborhoods of Brooklyn, where poverty, immigrant struggle, and street violence shaped his early understanding of survival. From those formative years, he absorbed lessons in risk, negotiation, and the subtle psychology of intimidation. He understood the dynamics of fear and ambition before he ever held real power, and these insights would serve as the foundation for a life that would redefine organized crime in America. But what makes his story compelling is not just the violence or the audacity of his methods. It is the intelligence and strategy underlying every decision, the foresight to see patterns where others saw only chaos, and the ability to manipulate both people and systems with precision. By the 1930s, Luciano had transformed the Mafia from a collection of warring factions into a disciplined, hierarchical, and extraordinarily efficient network. Through the creation of the Commission, he centralized authority while preventing the kind of destructive infighting that had previously plagued the underworld. He institutionalized loyalty through omerta, codified behavior, and applied psychological insight to enforce obedience without the constant need for violence. Every alliance, every operation, and every calculated threat was part of a larger strategy designed to maximize profit, maintain stability, and expand influence. In many ways, Luciano's genius lay not in his willingness to commit violence, but in knowing when to wield it, when to negotiate, and when to rely on structure and perception to control outcomes. Yet, Luciano's story is not one of unchallenged power. The same brilliance that allowed him to dominate the underworld also made him a target of law enforcement, public scrutiny, and internal rivalry. His arrest and trial on charges of compulsory prostitution marked a pivotal moment, demonstrating both the limits of personal power and the vulnerability inherent in operating outside the law. The courtroom drama, amplified by media sensationalism, became a public spectacle, turning Luciano into a symbol of both fear and fascination. The trial underscored the precariousness of his empire, yet it also highlighted the resilience of the systems he had built. Even as he faced a lengthy prison sentence, the hierarchy, loyalty, and strategic structures he had established ensured that his influence persisted, illustrating that power is often less about presence than about perception and architecture. Prison was, paradoxically, both a constraint and a proving ground. From behind bars, Luciano continued to exercise influence, demonstrating that authority is not solely derived from proximity. He manipulated human behavior, maintained communication networks, and guided operations through trusted lieutenants. The psychological mastery he displayed in confinement mirrored the intelligence and foresight that had allowed him to dominate the streets. In doing so, Luciano transformed what could have been a period of decline into a demonstration of resilience, adaptability, and strategic patience. The empire he had constructed was not a fragile, personality-driven machine. It was a living, self-sustaining system that reflected decades of observation, experimentation, and insight into human behavior. Exile in Italy presented another set of challenges, but Luciano approached them with the same strategic intelligence that had defined his life. Deported from the country he had conquered, he faced unfamiliar political landscapes, new criminal actors, and a society in flux. Yet he adapted, maintaining influence, guiding operations, and negotiating with both allies and authorities. His exile highlights a remarkable aspect of his genius: the ability to project power across distance and circumstance, demonstrating that influence can transcend physical presence when systems, psychology, and reputation are aligned. Even in isolation, Luciano's mind remained a force that shaped outcomes, a testament to his ability to wield control through intellect as much as action. Luciano's life also illustrates the moral complexity of power. While he is often celebrated for his strategic brilliance and organizational genius, his methods involve violence, exploitation, and manipulation. The duality of his legacy, as a master strategist and as a man responsible for suffering, reflects the broader truth that power is rarely benign. His story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about ambition, morality, and the human capacity to shape systems for both personal gain and collective impact. It is a narrative in which intelligence and ruthlessness coexist, where foresight and manipulation are tools for survival, and where the consequences of success are inseparable from the methods employed to achieve it. Psychologically, Luciano's journey provides a study in resilience, adaptability, and the management of human behavior. He understood the interplay between fear, respect, and loyalty, and he engineered systems that leveraged these forces to sustain control. Whether through the strategic use of omerta, the orchestration of alliances, or the disciplined management of criminal enterprises, Luciano demonstrated that power is as much about perception and structure as it is about strength or wealth. His ability to anticipate human behavior, exploit opportunities, and maintain influence in diverse circumstances reflects a profound understanding of psychology applied to strategy, an insight that remains relevant in fields far beyond organized crime. Ultimately, Luciano's story is a cautionary tale as well as a chronicle of genius. It illustrates the rise and fall of a man who could build an empire from chaos, who could turn fear into loyalty, and who could project power across distance and circumstance. Yet it also reminds us that even the most brilliant systems and the most calculated strategies are vulnerable to law, betrayal, and unforeseen events. His life underscores the interplay between human ambition, societal forces, and the structures that sustain power, revealing both the possibilities and limitations of influence. As the final chapter unfolds, we see that Luciano's legacy is multifaceted. He left behind systems, hierarchies, and strategies that reshaped organized crime in America and influenced networks globally. He created psychological frameworks that guided loyalty, discipline, and obedience. And he embodied the duality of human endeavor, capable of brilliance and innovation, yet inseparably linked to violence and moral compromise. The mythos of Lucky Luciano, the master strategist, the architect of the modern mafia, endures not only because of his actions, but because of the system's psychology and vision he employed to achieve them. In conclusion, the story of Lucky Luciano is more than a tale of crime. It is a study in power, psychology, and human complexity. It is a journey through the rise of an empire, the management of loyalty and fear, the resilience of influence under constraint, and the adaptation of strategy to changing circumstances. It is a reminder that genius can manifest in the shadows, The human behavior can be engineered and leveraged, and that systems can outlast even the individuals who create them. Luciano's life teaches that power is both a personal and structural endeavor, a balance of intellect, psychology, and strategic vision, and that the mark of enduring influence lies not just in conquest, but in the architecture and resilience of the world one leaves behind.